The purpose of the symposium annually is to explore and debate some of the most probing questions about faith, life, and a number of different things through panel discussions, lectures, debates. We have a multi-author book coming out soon. It'll be published in May by Routledge. One of our debaters is a contributing author to that. It is Faith in God Reasonable? Debates in Philosophy, Science, and Rhetoric. So we welcome those of you who are here live that weathered through the storm that's still happening outside, and those live stream. We're thankful for the 30-plus sponsors for this event, many of whom you saw scrolling on the screen behind me as you came in. Thankful for Purdue's philosophy department, who helped add some to get one of our speakers for their philosophy colloquium yesterday. And I'm especially grateful for the executive team that helped us out to put this thing together for the weekend. Despite the catchy title, or not so catchy, what would Jesus do and what would Darwin do? This debate that you're about to watch is not really about Jesus and Darwin per se. It's not about creation and evolution. It's really about God, secularism, and morality. Can we have a robust ethics without God? When it comes to seemingly black and white issues of human slavery and sex trafficking, if indeed they are black and white, perhaps they're symptomatic issues that smack in the face of what we would consider robust human dignity. And it may seem obvious how we ought to feel or how we ought to act or think about these things. And while there is broad agreement among many people on this topic, spanning political left and right, secular and religious alike, it may not be so obvious after all. We want to ask the question whether there really is such a thing as injustice. Is there such a thing as justice? When a wolf spots an injured rabbit in the wilderness, it doesn't exactly provide a Band-Aid and a get-well card. It usually just eats him. Why should we be any different as humans compared to other animals? Our debaters are going to present their respective viewpoints from theism and atheism, followed by dialogue and Q&A from the audience. We'll have microphones set up here, so consider what kinds of questions might be germinating as you're watching this. And so the discussion for the debate and dialogue today will center on the questions of which worldview best explains or accounts for or otherwise grounds these commonly held moral intuitions and beliefs that so many of us share on issues like this, as well as which provides the best intellectual resources and reinforces the motivation to combat such injustice as topics that we're concerned about here at this conference. Is it the Christ compassion narrative, or is it the jungle cooperative narrative? What would Jesus do? What would Darwin do? A dialogue concerning radical social injustice. Let me introduce the opponents of today's debate. Our first presenter, about to be invited on stage, is Dr. John Hare. Dr. Hare is a British-born philosopher and son of the relatively well-known British utilitarian philosopher R.M. Hare. John Hare's moral philosophy, while integrating both Kantian and utilitarian ethics, includes elements of divine command theory as well, arguing that only theistic religion can bridge the moral gap between human ability and the moral demand. His undergraduate degree was from Oxford, and he holds a PhD in philosophy from Princeton University. Among his many publications includes books such as God and Morality, The Moral Gap, Why Bother Being Good, and Ethics and International Affairs. He's also a published composer. Having taught at both Lehigh University and Calvin College, he is now the Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology at Yale Divinity School, Yale University. Please welcome on stage with me, Dr. John Hare. Our next presenter is Dr. Michael Ruse. After having taught for 35 years at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, where he must have determined that it was entirely too cold up there and, retirement was for the birds, he went down and took another job in Florida to go to Disney World, where he's now on faculty at Florida State University. He's shocked coming up here with this weather today. He is now the Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor of Philosophy and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science at Florida State. He founded the journal Biology and Philosophy. He is also the author and editor of many, many books on the history and philosophy of evolutionary biology, and books extending to the fields of science, religion, and ethics. For example, Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? The Relationship Between Science and Religion. Biology and the Foundation of Ethics. Debating Design, co-edited with the leading intelligent design proponent, William Dembski. Darwinism and its discontents, and Science and Spirituality, Making Room for Faith in the Age of Science. Please welcome with me on stage Dr. Michael Ruse. We've seen over 100,000 hits on YouTube from last year's debate here at the symposium, Is Faith in God Reasonable?, which can be seen on our symposiachristi.com website. While there is a lot of interest, obviously, in that traditional format of debate, there is also interest in more of a conversational or dialogical format. So for this year, we've decided to do things a little bit differently. The structure of our debate today will be as follows. Each speaker is going to have a 20-minute statement followed by their opponent, and then have a 5-minute rebuttal. And then for the next hour, we'll divide that in half. We'll sit on the set here, and we will have tea in good British fashion, because both of our opponents are of British origin, and that's going to make it sound a whole lot smarter. Then we'll take the next half an hour, and we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. The theme this year, again, is human dignity, slavery, and sex trafficking. Which worldview best accounts for our moral beliefs and sentiments on the matter, and which provides the most robust moral motivation for combating the seemingly obvious social injustice? What would Jesus do? What would Darwin do? Professor Hare is going to approach the lectern first. Professor Hare?
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. And it's good to have a chance to talk together about topics that Michael Ruse and I both care about. 3 things we're not going to disagree about, I think. The first is whether some form of evolutionary theory is true. I'm perfectly satisfied that it is, and that the theory gives us an enormous amount of good science. The second thing is whether Christianity is consistent with evolutionary theory. Both of us think it is. And Professor Ruse has been one of the great peacemakers in this regard, explaining to each party the attractions of the other. The third thing is that human trafficking is a radical injustice, and we should do what we can to stop it. So we're not going to disagree about those things. What does that leave us to talk about? The topic of this conference is human dignity, how it is violated, and what are its foundations. Here, Professor Ruse and I do not agree. Ruse makes a useful distinction between the question, what is right and wrong, and the question, why it is right and wrong. Our dispute is about the second, about what kind of foundations there are for our sense of right and wrong, and in particular, for our sense that humans have dignity and rights that we have an obligation not to violate. On this why question, Ruse is a moral skeptic. He does not think this sense of right and wrong has a justification at all. He thinks it is an illusion foisted on us by our genes, in the same way we might have a visual illusion, a mirage of an oasis in the desert. We really have the sensation, but the oasis is not really there. My view, by contrast, is that morality does have a justification, and that justification is theistic, that what it is right and wrong to do is what God has commanded or forbidden us to do. These two positions about the foundations of ethics are not the only two possible positions. For example, perhaps morality does have a justification, but it's not theistic. Or perhaps morality does not have a justification, but that's not because it is an illusion, as Ruse thinks, but rather it is without justification in the way an axiom in a system is without justification. It is itself foundational, and it does not rely for its justification on anything else. There are many such beliefs we have. For example, the belief in the existence of the external world. But that's not Ruse's position or mine. The two options you have on the platform are moral right and wrong are an illusion given us by natural selection, and morality is constituted by God's command. I want to start by giving two reasons why we might hope that Professor Ruse is wrong about this. We need some kind of justification because, first, not everybody is moved by the forces of natural selection to cooperate in the way morality requires. Moral obedience is fragile. We do find precursors of the moral sentiments in our non-human ancestors, but we also find aggression and defection, and we have inherited both of these tendencies. We are by nature, in this sense, a mixture. But this means we need support from our cultural sources, not only for our beliefs about what morality requires, but our beliefs about why we should comply with it or endorse it. Why I should take the moral demand as a valid demand upon me. This conference is about, among other things, human trafficking, a trade in human beings that denies the essential difference between what the philosopher Kant calls dignity and price. Humans have dignity, and this means that there is nothing of comparable worth that can be exchanged for them, in the way a ballpoint pen can be exchanged for $1. But this trade in human beings is run by people who do not acknowledge this dignity. We need to have something to say about why what they are doing is wrong. The second reason is that even if we are committed to the moral law, we need something to say to ourselves when that commitment becomes difficult to honor. There is substantial empirical evidence in the psychological literature that the force of the moral demand can be undercut by teaching that morality is an illusion. For example, a before and after study was done on students enrolled in 2 introductory economics courses and an introductory astronomy course. The students were asked at the beginning and at the end of each course what they would do if they found an addressed envelope with $100 in it. I do not mean at all to insult my colleagues in economics. I merely report that while the students scored the same in the economics and astronomy courses at the beginning of the semester, the economics students were significantly more willing to keep the money at the end. It's plausible to suggest that the difference lay in the content of the courses, in which they were taught, in line with old-style neoclassical theory, that people act in their own enlightened self-interest. Now, Professor Ruse is not arguing that we are motivated only by our own interests. He wants to say that morality is genuine in the sense of sincere, even though it is not genuine in the sense of non-illusory. He thinks we really do have the moral sentiments. But my point is that saying, and here I quote from him, ethics is an illusion put in place by natural selection to make us good cooperators, that is likely to have the same undercutting effect as the economic theory I have described. Let me give you a thought experiment to make this vivid. The ancient Epicureans used to believe that the gods, while they existed, had no care for us, and they set us up and watched us for their own entertainment, rather in the same way we watch soap operas on television. Now, suppose they gave us a moral sense, just because that would make our endless agonizing more psychologically interesting to watch. We would then really have that moral sense, but it would not be tracking any moral reality. Suppose I discover this about the gods. What effect will that have on my motivation? I will still have the moral sense, but I will come to see that it is without justification, that it is an illusion. I think I will then try to discount it. I will feel the urge to help my neighbor in some sacrificial way, and I will say to myself, that's just the gods again, curse them. Professor Ruse concedes that sometimes morality will tell us to do what is not to our adaptive advantage as individuals. I think if I believed him about the illusion, and I felt the moral prompting to sacrifice, I would say, that's just the genes again, curse them. Suppose you decide this afternoon that Ruse is right. What are you supposed to do tomorrow? What will be your basis for endorsing the feelings you will no doubt still have that trafficking in human beings is wrong? I say this because I know people whose moral commitment has in fact been undercut by views like Ruse's about morality being an illusion. I used to have a distinguished colleague when I taught at Lehigh University. His name was Donald Campbell. He was president of the American Social Psychologists Association. He used to have views rather like those of Professor Ruse. But he also accepted the point that these views tended to have an undercutting effect, such as I have described. He therefore refused to write for the general public and kept these views to the domain of scholarship, because he did not want what he called the preachments of the tradition about justification to lose any force they currently have. So, here are two reasons to hope Professor Ruse is wrong. But perhaps it's just an unfortunate truth that morality is an illusion, and that recognizing this tends to undercut its force. Perhaps it's like the sad truth that it is really our parents who put the presents under the Christmas tree. Do I have any reason to think Ruse is wrong, and not merely that if he's right, that's unfortunate? I'm going to argue this way. Our sense that we are tracking what is really binding upon us when we discern right and wrong should be given the benefit of the doubt, like our sense that we're tracking the external world in perception. In neither case is our access infallible. Perhaps my neighbor decided to fool me with a hologram of a goldfinch projected on the tree just outside my window. But if we count this sense of tracking the moral truth as innocent, so to speak, until it's proven guilty, we still have to look at the arguments people give for thinking it's guilty, or, in Ruse's term, illusory. He has basically two arguments for this, and he takes them both from John Mackey, who took them indirectly from David Hume. I remember a seminar at Oxford I was privileged to attend in the early 1970s, taught by John Mackey, my father R.M. Hare, and John McDowell. They hashed out these questions we are now discussing. Mackey had two arguments for what he called error theory, the theory that our moral judgments are in fact just expressions of emotive attitude, but that we project these attitudes onto the world and make the error that there are real objective facts about right and wrong that make our judgments true. Mackey's two arguments were what he called the argument from queerness and the argument from relativity. I'm going to argue rather cheekily that Professor Ruse ought not to accept either of them any longer because of differences that he has come to have in other parts of his theory from John Mackey. First, the argument from queerness. Mackey holds that the existence of things in the world and their causal relations must in the end be explained by science. But the notion of something objective in the world, like rightness and wrongness, is, in Mackey's term, queer, or inexplicable by scientific theory. He accepted that it might make sense if we believed in a God who was prescribing, but, he said, science acknowledges no such thing. The argument from relativity is that human moral systems are just too different from each other to allow explanation in terms of something like rightness and wrongness, as it were beaming the norms down to us. Ruse does not use the term queer for explicable reasons, but he does hold that it is biological theory that requires us to take the skeptical position about justification. At the causal level, what is going on, he says, is probably individual selection maximizing our own reproductive ends. And there's no room here for objective rightness and wrongness. With respect to relativity, Ruse argues that evolution could have given us all sorts of different moral norms. But he argues, if there could be all these different moralities, how can there be a single objective moral truth behind them all? But now what's striking, and this is the cheeky part, is that Professor Ruse has departed in many ways in his overall theory from John Mackey. Mackey was no peacemaker in the Ruseian mold. He was a feisty Australian atheist who thought theism was, as he quoted from Hume sarcastically, a miracle. Ruse, on the other hand, wants to expose the overreaching character of some contemporary militant Darwinism that wants to turn science into metaphysics, to make science the arbiter of all truth. Darwinism, he says, and I quote, should not try to say everything. Whether there is or is not a God, Ruse says he doesn't know, and science doesn't tell him. I would classify him as an agnostic because of this, rather than an atheist. I propose he ought, for consistency, to say the very same thing about objective morality. But Mackey's argument from queerness requires the premise that anything that has causal relations with the world must be accessible to science. Ruse, at least sometimes, now wants to deny this. And if he does deny it, then the foundation of the argument from queerness disappears. Similarly with relativity. If we'd evolved differently, we would no doubt have a different set of values. But does this show that there is no objective right and wrong? Only if we say also that the only things we should say exist are the things we can verify by scientific means. Ruse, at least sometimes, now wants to deny this. So to conclude this part of the argument, I think there is a tension in Ruse's thought, and I would urge him to regain consistency by rejecting the skeptical holdover from the less generous views of his mentor. I left myself rather little time to talk about my own views. I have proposed a theistic justification for morality, that God constitutes what's right and wrong by command and prohibition. This does not mean that people who do not believe in God cannot be morally good. In fact, to the contrary, many non-believers put many believers to shame, morally speaking. But I think there is what Kant calls a rational instability in the combination of morality and atheism. I defended this view in detail yesterday in the philosophy department, and I cannot do it here. But I want to reply to 3 common objections to it. And I hope the nature of the view will become clearer as I make these replies. The objections are that my view makes morality arbitrary, that it reduces human autonomy, and that it is inconsistent with religious pluralism. Then finally, I want to say something about just how belief in God grounds a belief in human dignity. All this is a lot to do in a couple of minutes, and I hope you will excuse the extreme brevity of these remarks. So first, the objection from arbitrariness. If God's command constitutes moral rightness, doesn't this mean that just anything could be right if God commanded it? For example, torturing babies? This is an ancient objection, associated with Socrates. There's a good answer to it by distinguishing right from good. God's command constitutes rightness, not goodness. This allows us to say that God selects among the infinite number of good things which good things to require, and only those things become obligatory for us. God is in this way like a parent, selecting what good things to set as tasks for her child so that she can become most truly herself. And I'll say something at the end along these lines about the goodness of human life and what makes it good. The second objection is from human autonomy. Saying that rightness is constituted by God's command seems to put us into the position of small children obeying our parents. But I'm not saying that we don't need to work out what to do. I'm just saying that in this working out, we're trying to repeat in our wills God's will for our willing. The philosopher Kant, whom I've already mentioned, says that we have to recognize our duties as God's commands. But that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of moral reasoning. Religious people put themselves and their lives inside a narrative of sacred history in which God shows progressively the nature of the divine character, and we try to discern in our own different situations what is consistent with that character. The third objection is from pluralism. We live in a society in which there are lots of different religions and many people who do not identify themselves as religious at all. Surely tying morality to the commands of God leaves all these people out. But it's a mistake to think that pluralism requires us to stop using our own religious language in moral reasoning in the public square. What it requires is that each citizen be free to make his or her own argument using whatever religious or a-religious premises she or he prefers, making sure that the rights of the minority voices are preserved, and then letting democracy produce the outcome. Finally, just how does a belief in God ground a belief in human dignity? My idea is that God is calling each one of us to a unique union with God. For Christians, this is to enter into the deepest love possible, the love between the members of the Trinity. This union is not based on our current capacities, so that even those who are low in capacity are known and loved in this way and called to this union. The union is unique in that the kind of loving of God we're each called to depends on the kind of person we are created in God's image to be. Our dignity resides in this calling. This picture helps us to see that we can have an account of dignity that gives us more dignity than non-human animals, since God is not, as far as we know, calling them into this kind of union. But this account does not deprive some especially vulnerable human beings with limited current capacity of this claim to our respect. Our dignity, given by God, is secure. No person, no government has the power or authority to take it away. A couple of years ago, I debated with Peter Singer at MIT, and he agreed with me that if he were a theist, which he's not, he would have a justification for morality beyond the partial justification from self-advantage. And it would be good to have this. But because he's not a theist, he does not have it. I wonder whether Professor Ruse could agree to this as well, with one difference, that whereas Singer thinks he knows there is no God, Ruse doesn't know whether there is one or not. Thank you.
Now take the stage.
Thanks, John. That was, I thought, a very fair and gentle. I confess that I'm in a little state of culture shock. I'm also in a state of weather shock, too. It was 75 degrees yesterday, and I was in my shorts having my lunch. I didn't wear my shorts for lunch today, I can tell you. I've never been in a conference, sex, slavery, and human trafficking. And I'm wondering what's happened to me that at the age of 73, somebody thinks that I would be appropriate for me to be brought to a conference like this. And I read on, and it says, ex-sex slave, debate dialogue, ex-porn star. Professor Hare, are you the ex-sex slave or the ex-porn star? I want to find out what my role in this debate is supposed to be. You know, joking apart, this really is. It's tremendously important and it's tremendously interesting. And I think it is in this whole debate of God versus atheism, should you believe, should you not, Darwinism versus Jesus, Richard Dawkins, shall we say, versus the Pope, all of these things. I think that we start to see that there are some issues which are really important that we've got to grapple with here. Of course, we philosophers like to worry about things like the ontological argument. They're important, but they're important in a different sort of way. It's clear, though, that in the whole, what shall we say, Jesus versus Darwin or God versus atheism debate, there are some very important issues which come up. For instance, the whole problem of evil. That Auschwitz, how do you deal with those sorts of issues? And these are problems for grown-ups. And my personal feeling is, and I'm not giving way at all, is that we have to think these through for ourselves. And if somebody comes up with a position different from mine, I still think they're wrong. I'm certainly prepared to argue with them, as I will this afternoon. But at the same time, I feel a great deal of respect for somebody who doesn't agree with me. I think that these are issues that people can think about long and hard and come up with different sorts of positions on these. And I think the whole question of morality is absolutely central to this, and particularly the whole question of God and morality. Now, Professor Hare is in fact the son of a very well-known philosopher that I had to study when I was an undergraduate. And I hope Professor Hare will forgive me for saying that the tradition in which his father was working at the time somehow never struck me as having quite the moral seriousness at some sort of level that I felt that it should. I came from a Quaker background, and I grew up after the war, where we really grappled with these sorts of issues. And I hope you'll forgive me for saying this. This is not about your father in any sense, but it just seemed to me that we were at some level, back in those days, talking about morality and these things, somehow we weren't grappling with it as deeply as we should. And without showing off, I think that this Professor Hare and I are dealing with something really important. I think now we really are dealing with something which is for grown-ups. And this is this whole question about the basis of morality, and whether you can have a moral system without God, or whether you have to have God. If God does not exist, then are all things permitted? And this is where I want to start. In fact, I want to start about as seriously as I can. I want to tell you, and I expect some of you know who she is, and probably others of you don't know. I want to tell you about a young woman called Sophie Scholl. She was born in Germany in 1921. I think she was the fourth of 6 children, into a devoutly Lutheran family. As it happens, she read quite a bit of Catholicism, and there's word that possibly she would have converted by the end of her life, except she felt such a strong identification with the Lutherans, and particularly with her mother's deep Lutheranism. The Scholl family, 1921, Hitler comes to power in 1933. The Scholl family was always opposed to Hitler. You must understand that many Germans were always opposed to Hitler and National Socialism. Her brother actually went to fight, but then she's 20 years old. In 1942, 1943, They formed a group which was known as the White Rose Group. And they lived in Munich, and they started handing out pamphlets saying this war is wrong, what the Nazis are doing is evil. Well, as you can imagine, it took about 3 weeks before the authorities found who they were and captured them. She was put on trial. I mean, this whole thing, from the time of the capture to the time of her death was 4 days. They were put on trial. Of course, they were found guilty and condemned to execution. They're condemned to execution. Earlier in the day, she was guillotined at 5 o'clock that evening. As she went to her death, she said, and I quote, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, but what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" I cannot say this, and I feel the tears are welling up as I say this. This is a young woman of 21 years old who goes to her death so bravely because of what she thought was morally right. I draw two things from this. First, that morality exists. Don't ever, ever think that I don't think morality exists. That woman is such a shining beacon of morality. As I say, I'm not worthy to, wipe her shoes. At the same time, I have to say, I draw from this the motto or the conclusion that the God of Christianity does not exist. A loving Father who's all-loving, who's all-powerful, does not let Sophie Scholl die on the guillotine. He does not. And so these are the two. This is my starting place. Morality does exist. I'm not here to tell you that morality is all an illusion in the sense that it doesn't exist. Morality exists. But at the same time, I cannot accept the God that Professor Hare and many other people do accept. Now, as I say, I say this, I don't say this with regret, because I think I'm right, and I think my position is the right one. But I say it with respect because it does not mean I'm not a new atheist. I do not think that people who disagree with me on this are fools or wrong. And I certainly don't think that if Professor Hare brings up his children, or any of you who are Christians who bring up your children as Christians, are, as Richard Dawkins said, indulging in a form of child abuse. So please understand where I'm at. I respect you. However, I think morality does exist, and I'm absolutely, completely convinced that the God of Christianity does not exist. So this is, if you like, my starting point. Now, I want to get one thing out of the way immediately. I recognize that different societies have different moralities. I don't take this to mean that morality does not exist. I don't take this as to mean that in some sense morality is not objective, if you want to say. And I certainly don't take this as relativistic. I say, of course we're going to have different cultures, and of course we're going to have different aspects of knowledge and what people know about. In fact, this morning, in order to prepare for this talk, I picked up in the hotel, as you know, there's always a Gideon Bible, and so I picked it up. Oh my God, we're staying in a Marriott. This is the Book of Mormon. I've got the wrong book here. No, not really. If you do stay in the Marriott, by the way, folks, if you're having trouble getting to sleep, pick up the Book of Mormon. I reckon about four verses, and I'm off in the land of Nod. And I read the passage. I read the passage about Abraham and Sarah, and they couldn't have children. And of course, this is pertinent, actually, to the broader context of this weekend. Now, Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abraham, he wasn't Abraham yet, heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, a maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. That's a sex slave. That's a sex slave, folks. That really, Hagar didn't have any choice. She was a slave, and she was being used for their benefits. Of course, they wanted a child. They didn't want just to have a good bout of sexual intercourse, but she was being used in a sexual fashion. Now, how do I deal with something like this? Do I say, and therefore that goes to show that all morality is relative? No, I'm quite happy to say that there are aspects of this story which don't show much morality. I think Sarah's behavior towards Hagar is understandable, but it's morally despicable, particularly when she tells Abraham to throw her out. So that's going on. I recognize that. But I'm perfectly prepared to say, of course, an awful lot that we now think we know, they didn't know. For instance, about the nature of women. I mean, even as I grew up, it was certainly argued quite seriously that women aren't really suited for higher education. They menstruate and all those sorts of things, and when they've got their periods, clearly their minds aren't working properly. We know that's, it's just false. It's biologically false. And I think that an awful lot of the moral decisions we make today, and we always make, are going to be based not on morality, but on how exactly we think the facts are going to be. I've mentioned capital punishment. I'm violently against capital punishment. Part of the argument I use is an empirical argument, that in fact capital punishment does not cure the crime problem, and many other things like that. These are empirical arguments. These are not moral arguments. So I do want to say that although I recognize a lot of relativity in actual working of morality, that does not follow for me that morality is in any sense not universal and completely goes through all of humankind. So this is my problem. How do I justify a moral position like that? Now, very quickly, there are two ways in which you can do it without God. First of all, you can argue for what are known in the trade as non-natural properties. You can say that morality is a little bit like the way a lot of people, most mathematicians, regard mathematics. It's not part of this world, but it's absolutely real. It's not God's heaven, but there is, as it were, a transcendent world of existence where right-angled triangles are 3, 4, 5 triangles are right-angled triangles, not isosceles triangles, for instance, and where love your neighbor as yourself is also an absolute truth. And there have been some very good philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century. G.E. Moore, the English philosopher, was one of them, who believed in these sorts of things. Now, as Professor Hare made clear, how you argue against this can get very complex and very sophisticated. But basically, I don't find that position particularly convincing because apart from anything else, I just don't know how human brains can intuit these non-natural properties. I just don't know how, as it were, we can make that leap from us to these and back again. I feel the same way about mathematics. I would say I don't find it particularly helpful to think that mathematics is something out there. But at least I recognize this as a position. But as I say, I don't find it convincing because my main problem is, first of all, where is this other world? In what dimension is it? And secondly, how is it that we can access it? I can access this world. I had lunch with Steve, for instance. I can access that I see Steve, that I know that with some regret, because I just had a small sandwich, he felt that he couldn't have the big one that he really wanted, that sort of thing. This is the world I live in and that Steve lives in, and I can access in that way. So my problem with non-natural properties is I don't know how I access these. So I have to say, at some level, I think morality is part of this world, like like human beings, like thoughts, like desires, and all of these sorts of things. And in fact, I do believe that at some level, morality has to be emotions. And of course, at this level then, I think I'm very much with Professor Hare's father, because at some level, I think that that was the philosophical tradition within which he was working. So at some level, I'm with Professor Hare's father. Now, the question I want to ask, though, is, yes, morality exists. So what is it? Where do we get it from? Now, there are some people, Herbert Spencer was one in the 19th century, Julian Huxley, the older brother of Aldous Huxley in the 20th century, was somebody who believed this. And most well known in the second half of the 20th century is Professor Edward O. Wilson at Harvard. And they think that you can read morality out of the world just like you can read other physical facts. We can read out of the world, for instance, that the dinosaurs existed and then went extinct. We can read morality that you ought to love each other and that sort of thing out of the world. It's a fact of the world, just like colors are and other sorts of things like that. Now, again, very quickly, I don't think that works, because I think that there are, and I particularly don't think that evolution in that sort of sense leads to morality in the sense that it justifies it. Because it seems to me that evolution leads to selfishness, it leads to hatred, it leads to tigers tearing up their prey without a moment's thought. It leads to all of these, and I don't necessarily think that these are particularly good. It leads, for instance, to a lot of young men having rapist tendencies. Now, you read the stories about the German soldiers marching into East Prussia in 1944, 1945. I know why they did it. If you want, I could see at some level it was natural. I also think it was deeply morally wrong. So in other words, my point is, I don't think you can just read morality out of the world in that sort of way. So what do I end up by saying? I think that morality is something that biology and culture can explain. I think that today's biologists show us, and Darwin showed us, that not all success in evolution comes from just fighting, that cooperation can be a very good biological strategy indeed. I mean, we see, for instance, in the social insects, the workers give their whole lives to the nest, and I think they do it because of their biology. So I do see morality at some level being developed by biology. I'm more than happy to because we're humans, bring in a cultural element as well. So I see morality as being entirely natural. What I don't see is morality as being justified by God, by non-natural properties, or even by the physical world. So where do I end up? Well, at some level then, and I'm on record as saying this, and I'm sure if I don't say it, one of you is going to say it before the end of the day. I'm on record as saying I think morality is an illusion put in place by our genes to make us social cooperators, and I do believe that. But notice, I don't think that morality doesn't exist. When I use the word illusion, I don't think there's any justification to morality. Now you say, well, you've given, but now you take it all away. And at one level, yes, I do. I think that this is the grown-up world in which we are. I think this is the world without God. So at some level, I don't think morality has a justification. However, I do think that morality is very much part of us. I think that biologically we need morality. And I think, therefore, that, and Professor Mackey was mentioned, and this is very much out of his book, I think that part of the emotion of morality is to think that it's not just emotions, but that somehow it is objective, it does really exist, that rape isn't just a question of, I don't like rape, don't you rape either, or something like that, but that rape is wrong. I believe that, but I think it's part of my biology to believe that, and I think my biology has made me, and to use a very ugly word, objectify morality, so that I, as it were, project. Now you're all going to say, well, that's an awful position that he's taking. Well, it may be, but notice, this is my position that I feel I'm forced to take because of my non-belief in God. If God doesn't exist, then I've got to pick up the pieces and put them together. So to conclude, I don't think morality is relative. I think we're all humans. I think we're all in this. I don't think that anything goes. I think we can make judgments, just as you can make a judgment, let's say, since football's coming up, in a football game. I think that, for instance, roughing up the quarterback or roughing up the kicker is a transgression in football. And I think that rape is a transgression in morality. But ultimately, I think morality is emotion. So in fact, I do share very much, I think, at one level position with, if not with your father, at least very much with the tradition from which your father stemmed. So I do think morality is emotions. But I think morality is more than just emotions or likes and dislikes, like I like chocolate ice cream, I don't much like pistachio. I think morality has this thing where we project this objectivity, and it just keeps us all up. In other words, those of you who've done some philosophy, my position is very similar to that of David Hume. Ultimately, I don't think there are justifications. I don't think there's justification for thinking that tomorrow will be like today. I think ultimately, if you like, it's a matter of faith. I don't think it's Christian faith or religious faith, but at some level, it's a part of our psychology. And I think that morality is too. But within that, I think that I can have a perfectly good, a perfectly workable morality. And call me an illusionist, if you like, but don't call me a relativist. And don't say that I just think that anything goes. Because the story of Sophie Scholl tells me that Hitler and Himmler and Goering and all these other people were wicked, wicked, wicked people. And Sophie Scholl was a saint. Thank you.
Dr. Hare, 5-minute rebuttal.
I want to say three things. The first is that Professor Ruse has not addressed what seemed to me the main difficulty, which is the tendency of his view to undercut morality. Because for him, it's not just that morality doesn't have a justification. It is, as he said at the end, an illusion. We have this tendency, he says, from our emotions to think that there is objectivity, to objectify, but that's an error. There isn't any such thing. He's not saying that we don't have the moral sentiments. We do have those things. We have those emotions. But they cause us to think that there is something objective there to which our morality, our emotions correspond, and there isn't any such thing. And that has a tendency to undercut our commitment. That's the problem. That's what he needs to address. Second thing, it was very interesting to me that he said this was a position that he was forced to. He said, you may think this is an awful position, but this is the position that I'm forced to because I cannot accept the God of Christianity. And what that suggests to me is that he agrees with Peter Singer. If you remember at the end of what I said, I asked whether he'd be willing to agree with Singer on this, that if he were a theist, if he did believe in the God of Christianity, or just in God, he would have a justification, and that would be a very good thing to have. I think he does agree with that, but I'd be anxious to hear him say it. The third thing now, because I'm my father's son, I just have to, I can't resist saying he wasn't himself an emotivist. He regarded himself as in the tradition of Kant, trying to say what Kant wanted to say. He thought that there was rational justification and that it's not just a matter of emotion. Morality contains emotions. We do have moral feelings about things, and they're very important for our lives. But they're not the whole thing, because sometimes I have to do what's right even if I don't feel like it, even if I don't have any emotion telling me to do it. There are some things I have to do. Sometimes I have to get up in the morning, even though I don't have any feeling telling me to do so. So morality is something that binds us, whether we have the feelings or not. That's what I wanted to say.
I was about to say, I don't want this discussion to degenerate into a discussion about your father, and realized how unbelievably insulting that sounds. Of course, and I have terrific respect. I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, I grew up on your father's writings, so I have terrific respect for what he's doing. And of course, I recognize that within prescriptivism or emotivism, of course, there's going to be a place for rationality. I mean, for instance, part of what John Rawls called the whole question of reflective equilibrium, I think is going to come in here. You may feel very strongly about two different things and then say, but they clash. And now I've got to sit down and use my reason to see why there is this clash and whether we can resolve this. I feel very strongly, let us say, that I feel very strongly that abortion is permissible and that capital punishment is not. And you say to me, but aren't you being inconsistent here in destroying life in the one case, but permitting it in the other? And of course, I think that at a time like this, it's not emotions, it's going to be an awful lot of rational discussion. And I certainly, I take that point as very well taken. But going back to the earlier thing, and I think it's good, I think this is the point at which we came in, and I think this is where we should be. I mean, you talk about being forced to take it. Yes, of course I am. Ultimately, this is a question of whether or not God exists. And I think that if you think that God exists, certainly the Christian God, then at some level, your morality is necessarily going to be framed in these sorts of terms, whether or not you're a Protestant and you think that the morality is going to be something read straight out of the Bible, let's say, or whether or not you're, let's say, a Thomist who's in the Aristotelian tradition and think that you're going to appeal to natural law and that you've got to see what is natural, what God has created, and that therefore you're going to take your position as there. For instance, your attitude about sexual behavior is going to be dictated not directly on what you find in Leviticus, but what you think is in fact something which is natural or non-natural. So I do recognize that if you've got God, then obviously you've got a justification. But where do you go if you're like me and you don't have God? If, like me, you cannot, in your heart of hearts, whatever your emotions may be, in your heart of hearts, you have to say, I cannot accept the existence of the Christian God. I cannot accept Auschwitz, the death of Anne Frank, the death of Sophie Scholl, I cannot accept the Christian God. I cannot. So yes, I am forced. But at the same time, I do believe very strongly in morality. I do believe that what Sophie Scholl did was transcendently good, or Maximilian Kohl, or many others, many, many others. And I do believe that what Hitler and Himmler and Goering and many, many others did, the people who betrayed the Frank family in Amsterdam, I do believe that what they did was morally wrong. So, yes, I am forced, if you like, but I don't see this as a weakness. I don't see this as something to paper over or to regret, if you like, or any of these things. Now, okay, it's like, you know, your credit cards have run up. I'm now forced to sit down and rethink my spending habits. I don't see that that's a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a very good thing in those situations. So I am forced to do this. And if you say, well, I don't find your position adequate, then I ask you, what would be adequate, given that I cannot accept the existence of the Christian God? It's as simple as that.
Okay, we're going to open up to a tea time. If someone could bring out our British tea.
You're going to do something awful, aren't you? You're going to give us hot water and tea bags.
Well, I don't know if we are trying to tame down the heated discussion here or just get the party started, but we have, let's see, we had in 1776 in this country, we had a little tea party. We've got Liberty here from Heritage Tea. Live free or die chai. That might not work. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Earl Grey tea. Maybe you guys just choose your tea. Andrew here is going to pour the cold water, hot water. Pour the water and allow you guys to, you gentlemen, go ahead and choose. I want to get back onto this. Earl Grey here.
I'll have Earl Grey too.
All right. They didn't like the live free or die chai.
Earl Grey was my ancestor.
Ah, your ancestor. By the way, Michael, my ancestors all the way back to 1836 were Mormon.
Well, there you are.
Now we've got to fight about my father.
You're going to take 10% off my honorarium, aren't you? I give it to the church. That's what they do.
Yeah. Well, another debate for another time. I want to digress just for a moment, because I'm intrigued by you for a number of reasons. And so we'll get back to the God and ethics question in just a moment, but to set the framework, and let me give the audience some background. I've learned about you that you're a skeptic. Some would say you're an atheist. Others would say you're an agnostic. Some atheists you've made very mad. I've heard you say in a lecture, not so far back, I don't remember exactly the date, but on Can a Christian be a Darwinian? Not quite the book, Can a Darwinian be a Christian, that you wrote, but that you're a conservative Christian non-believer.
Now, Protestant.
A Protestant.
Let's be very careful. I'm not a Mormon non-believer, and I'm not a Catholic non-believer. I'm a Protestant non-believer.
Okay. Protesting twice. Okay. Christians are spot on about original sin, minus the theology, of course.
Well, I've had 5 children, so I'll agree on that one.
I understand that one. Your title in our anthology that's coming out, drawing ire from both the atheist and Christian debaters in that one, is that faith in God is not reasonable, but not unreasonable. And as a follow-up, you're on record of saying some rather nasty and, dare I say, comedic things about the new atheists. And so, like Sam Harris, I've got some students here that were in an ethics class that we used Harris's book as sort of a side book that I taught, The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values. You suggest that Harris wasn't paying attention in his undergrad philosophy classes, and then conclude that if God, supposing God exists, of course, if God wanted to destroy the new atheism, getting this book written was a good start. So, since some have thought that maybe you're a covert operator for the other side, tell us, Dr. Ruse, what is your attitude toward the new atheism? Are you working for the other side? Are you a closet Christian going to come out of the closet today?
No. I should have brought along a review I've just written about the intelligent design people at the Discovery Institute. You'd never think that. I say, you can't make this sort of stuff up. It's so ridiculous. No, the answer is I'd like to say I'm nobody's person. Well, I am my wife's person, my various wives' person. That's for damn sure. But no, I'm neither. In a court case in Arkansas in 1981, and the assistant prosecutor for the state was trying to pin me down. And finally I said, Mr. Williams, can't you see I'm not an expert witness on my own religious beliefs? And it's true at a certain level. I do not accept the God of Christianity. I cannot accept that. I don't think, I'm not, I'm not a Unitarian in thinking that there's some sort of life force and we should tie ribbons on trees and that sort of thing. But I really am, at some sort of ontological level, really an agnostic, in the sense that I think quantum mechanics is mysterious. I think, at some level, I think the body-mind question, I'm a new Mysterian. Along with Brian McGinn, I just don't see us solving that. I don't think it's, I don't think it proves God, but I mean, there are mysteries. I do find life to be a mystery in many respects. So certainly that's my position. What I dislike about the new atheists is what I dislike about the discovery people. They're so convinced of their own rightness that it just irritates the hell out of me. Anybody who thinks they've got the truth in that kind of cocky way, and I don't know that John Hare thinks he's got the truth in that kind of cocky way. No, you know what I mean. Anybody who says, I'm absolutely certain of this, and these people are completely wrong. Anybody who says that bringing a child up Catholic is a form of child abuse, at some level, they're not morally worthwhile. The other thing I have very strongly...
Dawkins?
Dawkins, yeah.
Dawkins,
The other thing I have very strongly against the new atheists is one of the things I think I can truly say through my life is I've tried to be interdisciplinary. I've been a philosopher, I do history of science, I'm very interested in biology, and now I see you've marked up with all sorts of rude comments my most recent book, Science and Spirituality. Oh, there it is. And there's all sorts. I was looking at some of the things. We're going to have a few words about that. But, I mean, the point is, I think you would accept that I really do try to work through these things. I've just finished this book, Atheism, What Everyone Should Know. I found myself trying to work through what it means to have three different substances. Now, I try to take this seriously. Now, I think that some of the critics of evolutionary biology, and people like Thomas Nagel, big names in our field, Alvin Plantinga, and Mary Midgley, for instance. I mean, when she goes after Richard Dawkins on selfish genes and says, it's ridiculous, genes can't be selfish, I'm right with Dawkins to say, understand what he's trying to say and what the biology is there. I feel the same way about the new atheists looking at philosophy and looking at theology. To quote another of my funny comments in my reviews, if I might say so, when I read the God Delusion, I said, for the first time in my life, I feel sorry for the ontological argument, because I don't think that people like Dawkins, Dennett's a bit different. If you read Dennett, he's a hell of a lot more careful about those things. But I don't think Dawkins, and certainly Sam Harris, I just don't think they take my field or theology seriously. And all I can say is John Henry Newman and Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine were very, very clever people. And just to dismiss this as child abuse, it seems to me to be an abrogation of the spirit that everything I stand for as a philosopher and as a teacher. So, yeah, it is a moral issue with me. I really feel very strongly. If you're going to, you've got every right to not be a Christian, but you've not got every right to not be a Christian without having looked at it. It's just like Islamophobia. I think you've got every right to say, yes, there is that in Islam, which leads to a violent whatever. But you've not got the right to do it unless you've made at least some effort to find out what Islamic theology is. And, for instance, how Islam regards, the conquering of different lands and these sorts of things. And I think, in fact, there are aspects of Islam more so than Christianity, which do lead to these things. But you've got to do your homework first before you get in and just simply say everybody who's a Muslim is, in embryo, a 9/11 terrorist. That's just not true.
Well, I will say about your book, I think you were really fair, and I think you really understand rather well the Christian position and historic Christian theology.
So it makes it even worse that I reject it.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if you're going to come out of the closet today for us. And I did wonder, just as a follow-up, too, when you were talking about non-natural properties, you don't know how we would, so to speak, map onto those. But even in your chapter in our forthcoming book, you seem to, if it weren't for maybe a commitment to non-theism, you seem to be inclined toward dualism.
Yeah, at a certain level I am. I mean,
and would that not help your process?
I'm really quite
mapping
sympathetic
onto?
to Descartes. I mean, even though he's French, that's a joke. I'm English, he's French. I'm really quite empathetic to the body-mind dualism. I mean, we know it doesn't work, but as I say, so at some level, that's why I say I'm not sure we can solve the problem. But anybody who wants to say, like the Churchlands do, or Dan Dennett does, and this is a philosopher's argument. I'm not criticizing Dan now as a new atheist. I'm talking about, say, his position on the body-mind problem, where he thinks that by getting cognitive science out on the table, you've solved the problem. I just don't think that's right. I don't despise it. I don't think that Dan hasn't done his homework. So, as I say, this is not a criticism of him as a new atheist. Different sort of criticism. I don't think it works, but I know dualism doesn't work either. So that's why I'm a new Mysterian.
Okay. Care to follow up on anything, Dr. Hare, with that? Or?
Let me see. You say that you can't accept the God of Christianity, and so that's what forces you to think of morality as an illusion. And you tell stories of the Holocaust. But so let me remind you about Kant's point of view on this, and I think this was also my father's point of view. If you want a kind of justification for morality, it probably does have to come from theism. So then, which is stronger for you? Is it no Christian God, or is it morality? For you, it's no Christian God. But for Kant, it's morality. That's trumps. He's absolutely sure of that, and that, therefore, he requires the justification that God produces. He says morality inevitably leads to religion.
But John, I can only hold this position because, as a Humean, I'm giving a psychological analysis of why I want the justification and why, in everyday life, I can think that the sun will rise tomorrow and that morality is justifiable. So you're quite right. I do want a justification.
Yeah.
I don't think I can get it any more than I can prove the problem of induction. But am I going to give up and say, well, I won't get up tomorrow because the sun might not rise? No, of course I'm not going to do that. And when I see somebody doing something cruel, am I going to pull back and say, well, it's all emotions? No, of course I'm not. But I say that's you say forced to. That's what I do. I'm a Humean. Yeah. My psychology saves me from skepticism.
But notice this, that your strong reaction to these stories of the Holocaust, the ones that make you say there is no Christian God, what's motivating there is, I think, morality. It's your sense that there's something deeply wrong that's happened here, and no loving God could allow that. So actually, for you, morality perhaps is trumps.
But I think I've got morality. It's just, I don't, you see, the point is, this damn thing brings my voice in and out. You know, I feel a little bit like God Almighty. Sort of every now and then I bellow out at you and say, John, you're wrong. Well, that is God, isn't it? I've got morality at some sort of level. And my morality from day to day is just as strong as yours is, just as strong as your belief that the sun will rise tomorrow as mine is. So we've got morality. The question is, where do we go from there? And I'm quite prepared to accept that if you really want a justification, then probably you're going to have to go to God. I mean, I'm not uncomfortable. I mean, as I say, I don't rule out non-natural properties. I don't think natural properties will do it. Yeah. I don't rule out non-natural properties, but I'd want a much more philosophical convincing than I've got at the moment to do that. And my basic position is, you know, I'm a Platonist in this. If you've got to a world of a transcendental world of mathematics and morality, then, you know, what's a little God to add in on it? I mean, you know, you've already gone 9/10 of the way. Throw in the form of the good. I sound, you know, cockier than I really am because I worry about these things.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Hare. We'll come back again in this area, Dr. Ruse. I have this bracelet on here somewhere down deep. It doesn't say what would Jesus do or what would Darwin do, but it's the one I actually wear. What would Aristotle do?
Oh, I thought it was what does my wife expect me to do?
She's here.
Is she the one holding up the placard saying, "You're talking too much, dear, let them talk"?
Where is she? Let's see.
Sorry.
Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is perhaps the most popular Western philosophical text on the good life, morally and theoretically. You've written extensively on Aristotle, beginning with your Princeton dissertation many decades ago. Aristotle was no believer in the traditional concept of God. You say in your book, since I just pumped his for 1999 right here, now we've got God and Morality, A Philosophical History by John Hare. You say in your book something that was quite intriguing to me, that we should note that the Greek word theos, God, or theos, divine or godlike, occur in the Nicomachean Ethics roughly twice as often as the words for happiness or its cognates. Startling statistic when we consider that Aristotle considers happiness the goal of our lives. You, in many of your writings, say that Aristotle, God plays a prominent role in Aristotle. God plays a prominent role, even when it's not mentioned as such, in several ethical systems. In a certain respect, you think that goodness without God is not good enough. Leibniz made a statement, this is the father of calculus, an atheist can be a geometer, but without God there would be no geometry. Do you think it's the case then, Dr. Hare, an atheist can be moral, everyday morality, but without God there would be no morality?
I think people who don't believe in God can be morally good people. So there would be morality, and I think Professor Ruse is probably one of them. But I think there's something unstable about this combination. And it resides in this, at least partly in what I've been saying about justification. Hume thinks he can believe that the sun will rise tomorrow when he goes outside his study. But when he's inside his study, he can't say that any longer because it doesn't have any justification. And there's something unstable in the position of somebody who believes one thing in his study and another thing when he goes out into the world. It makes what you believe in the world fragile. That's my worry. Now, I think in all of the major ethical systems that we have in the West. There are really three main varieties. There's an Aristotelian virtue theory, a Kantian duty theory, and a consequence theory, utilitarian theory. All three of those, in their original and great formulations, had a central role for God. In Aristotle, in Kant, in Hutcheson and Paley, they have God at the center of them. And what I do in my philosophical work is I look at what happens to these ethical systems when you take God out. And what happens is you get a kind of incoherence, because God was systematically appealed to in these theories. And I'll just take one example, because I don't want to give you a long lecture about it. I do give long lectures about this, but I think it would be tedious. Or anyway, I'll just give you one example. So for Kant, what role is God playing? Why is it that he says morality inevitably leads to religion? And there are three things, I think, that are important for him. One is, if you're going to sustain the moral life, you have to think that the universe is run in a way that's consistent with morality having a point. So that how things ought to be is sustained fundamentally by how things are. That morality is not, therefore, absurd. And Kant thought we had to have some notion of providence to pull that off. You take God out, you get Camus. The second thing is, Kant thought we're born not naturally tuned to live a moral life. We have tendencies, what Professor Ruse calls original sin. We have tendencies towards preferring our own happiness to our duty. Sometimes morality requires us to do things that are very sacrificial. And Kant thought we need help from outside ourselves if we're going to lead a morally good life. And that's something he thought God did for us. That's grace. And then the third thing is, we need some answer to the question, why should I be a morally good person? Granted, I have these moral sentiments, I have these feelings, but if morality is just those feelings, why should I endorse them? Why should I live my life by those feelings? I have lots of other feelings too that aren't moral feelings. I need some kind of justification if my moral life is going to be stable, if it's going to make sense. And that's another role that God plays. We should think, Kant says, of our duties as God's commands. Though that's a complicated story, and I won't go further into it. But I just wanted to show you how in just one of the three, God plays an important role.
But John, can I just follow up? Because
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is really interesting. Now, let's suppose you've got somebody who sees somebody suffering. And the one person, the Humean, out of just sentiment, says, gosh, that person's in need. I'm going to, go out in the snow and do this. The other says, I really did want to watch Downton Abbey tonight. But the stern call of duty forces me to go out and do this.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me you're giving brownie points to the second person and not the first. And I don't want to say the second person isn't morally right, but I don't want to take away from the person who just simply says, and we all know different psychological types, and we do know those who just do it naturally, and we know others who dither and moan and whine and make them, but they'll do it.
Yes.
We all have colleagues like that.
Yes.
We say this is a boring committee, but it's important. And one says, of course I'll do it. and the other makes your life miserable, but you know that they will do it because they feel, and there's a third who won't.
Yeah.
And we all know the hypocrites who pretend that they want to but don't. Now, am I to praise the second person over the first?
Yeah.
And I ask this genuinely.
Yes, it's a good question. When I was chair of the department, I actually preferred to ask people who didn't at first want to do it, because I would be sure that they would finally do it. The people who said, yes, of course I'll do it, very often didn't. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing to say is this, okay, this duty-based morality is not actually saying you shouldn't have the feelings. Actually, the best kind of person, according to Kant and according to me, the best kind of person, I've gone off. Yeah.
Back on, I think.
Oh, back off. Okay. The best kind of person is somebody who both feels the sense of duty and feels the natural inclinations, has the sentiments, wants to do it out of a surge of compassion. And our moral progress is where those feelings come closer and closer and closer to what it is that duty prescribes. So there's a unity. It's a caricature to think we have to choose between the two. The best kind of person is the person who has both.
Okay. Coming back to something about the sentiments, you had mentioned if we do not have God for justification, I want justification. I don't necessarily have it because I've got to pick up the pieces. And you had mentioned a quote. This is the quotable quote of Michael Ruse, right? The position of the modern evolutionist, and I pronounce it that way just like you, evolutionist, is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves, and nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. So with that, you've no doubt seen probably these two books. This is a New York Times bestseller, The Rape of Nanking. Most of us don't know of this. We know of what the Nazis did in the Holocaust to the Jews. But some of the Nazis looked at what the Japanese did to the Chinese, which is pronounced Nanjing, and thought, wow, they're pretty radical. We're not so bad. Having fathers rape their daughters, sons rape their mothers, disembowel them afterwards, some really grotesque things. Obvious cases of injustice, just like our conference here. Many of this sex trafficking among children, obvious cases of injustice. But to come back to another, many of us would say, okay, there is an injustice because there is such a thing as justice. But if you have another book, Rape, A Natural History of Rape, Biological Basis of Sexual Coercion by two evolutionary biologists, they've taken a lot of heat for this book. They're not advocating rape by any means. But they are saying that if naturalism is true and the Darwinian paradigm is the one that explains human behavior and motivation and perhaps even feelings, things like that, that there has to be a good explanation for why people rape, and it's essentially that the strongest male in any population seeks to perpetrate in order to perpetuate its DNA. You clearly believe that rape is wrong. You've got other articles that talk about this. But with Dr. Hare, I'm wondering if you have any, you don't seem to have any justification to say that it's absolutely wrong.
Well, there are two different books here, and there are two different issues here. Let me just talk to the second one first. Then I'd like to get to the first one, because at a certain level, this is one I wrestle with a lot. My position is very much like the Christian position, is we're a mixture. If you like, we're created by a good God, but we're fallen. St. Paul says, I do what I don't want to do. And St. Paul's a very acute psychologist. And my position is, I think our biology is going to tug us both ways. Of course, our biology has to make us, if you like, selfish in a literal sense. Because if we weren't, we wouldn't survive. We have to think about ourselves. And every time we eat, we can't, as it were, immediately say, oh, well, there's starving children in Africa. I shouldn't be eating, or I should be, only taking a sugar cube or something like that. It wouldn't work. So the Thornhill book, as you say, is very controversial. But if somebody said young men have a natural propensity to say, it's only your mind I'm interested in, dear, as you're taking off their knickers, I'm happy to say that's biology, just as I'm happy to say it's biology when mothers say, dear, nice young men only are interested in one thing. So I see us as a combination, but I also see morality as an important adaptation. It doesn't mean that it's all going to come together hunky-dory. I see morality as a very good adaptation to make us social. I see other adaptations we're going to have to make us selfish. And I see us as a combination of these two working out. So in that sense, at the phenomenological level, if I can put it this way, I'm absolutely with the Christian. The Christian says people are good, people are bad. I want to understand why. The Christian says they're good because they're the children of God. They're bad because, however you take the Adam and Eve story, we're fallen. And so we're a combination. And my position is very much that sort of position. What I don't want to say, and I don't think, to the credit, I don't think Thornhill wants to say, is because it evolved, therefore it's good. And that, of course, was, I squeezed that into my, my presentation. And so if anybody says, oh, well, rape is part of our biology, so it was okay for those German soldiers, the Russian soldiers, to rape the German women, they had it coming to them, I want to say, no, it's wrong. Now, let me get to the first thing, the rape at Nanking. As it happens, I've got a German stepmother who grew up. Her family were Rudolf Steinerites, which meant they were violently anti-Hitler. But she, as happened in the 1930s, was a member of the Bund Deutsches Mädel. And my stepmother, who's about the same age as your mother now, 87 or something like that, to this day fights within herself that feeling that there was something good in the Third Reich. Because at that time, she felt a oneness with her fellow Germans that she's never felt ever again. And I think that what one can do is one can manipulate people to not just one person. We know that you can manipulate one person, but you can manipulate whole societies, I think, in this sort of way. So I think these are empirical questions. How much is biology? How much is culture? And I think we're still working those sorts of things out. But I'm quite prepared to say that it's possible to manipulate societies to go against their better nature. How long this would go on and how stable it would be, because the interesting thing is the Third Reich lasted all of 13 years. It didn't last 1,000 years. So it was clearly at some level a deeply unstable society. But I'm quite prepared to accept as an empirical issue that, those books which, Richard Evans is very good. There's a book called, Ordinary Soldiers, where he's trying to understand why these young men went in and killed Jews just like that. And Richard Evans' point is, these were not ordinary souls, ordinary men. He says these were not ordinary men. These were people who'd had 10 years of Goebbels, working on them. And so they were perverted. And I think that can certainly happen. So I'm not denying any of that. So this is the point. I don't like philosophies like religions, like the Mormons or Christian scientists, who are going to make everything different. Everything different. Somebody wrote a book, one of these Scottish idealists, who said, "I profoundly hope that nothing in this book is original." Okay, well, yeah. But at a point, I agree with it. Anybody who comes up with a whole new system which is going to make you completely rethink morality, I know it's wrong before I start. Now, it doesn't mean to say that my position can't challenge us to think about certain things. For instance, one of the things I think that Darwinism does push to, which we haven't raised, is it clearly, I think, is going to make you feel that you've got moral obligations towards your relatives or your closer kin than to the starving child in Africa that you don't know about. Whereas at least some readings of Christianity, although Peter Singer is not a Christian, he's had that reading which wants to say we owe indifferently to everybody. Now, I think that these are interesting questions. It's clear that not all Christians believe that. Even, it's even in the Bible, that you've got obligations to your mum and dad and your kids. And I'm not sure it comes from Jesus, but it does come from some of them. And certainly, my favorite novel is Bleak House, where Dickens is absolutely excoriating of these people who only care about, Borough land and ignore Joe the crossing sweeper. Dickens is saying, you've got obligations to your kids and to the poor in your own society. Look there first. So I'm not sure that my position is necessarily anti-Christian, but I do think that my position raises some of these issues, which I think are a place where I think Professor Hare and I could, as it were, have I'm not sure we could come to an agreement, but I can see a place where we could engage fruitfully, and how's that to put it, for a good grant proposal for the Templeton Foundation.
Professor Hare?
Yeah.
Is the microphone working okay? So one might look at this and say, okay, injustice is injustice only because there's such a thing as justice, or immorality is immoral because there is morality. Perhaps it implies a moral law maker. You've got a theistic argument, maybe from the problem of evil, which is a strong reason why Dr. Ruse rejects the Christian God, the problem of evil. Maybe evil turns on its head and gives us reason to believe that you have to have a God-like Christianity to have some kind of foundation. But if God is the foundation for morality, then how could such a God be worthy of our worship when he commands such evils, going back to Abraham, to kill his own son?
Yes.
He's not a very nice man, is he? There's a nasty edge there.
Non-discrimination up here.
We should face these stories. There are other stories too. There's slavery, for example, in Scripture. I mean, that's one of the topics of this conference. Let me say a word first about slavery and then about Abraham and Isaac. Paul sends a slave who'd become a Christian back to his master. Does he thereby endorse the institution of slavery? Well, what he does is he tells the master, I'm sending this slave back to you as a brother, because the master is also a Christian. So treat him as a brother, as you would treat me, he says. And then, so I said in my remarks, as believers, we enter into a narrative, a story, a sacred story. And as over the generations people reflected about this, when William Wilberforce reflected about this at the beginning of the 19th century, he came to think you couldn't have slavery and be a brother. There was something inconsistent here. Now, it's true, in the American Civil War, people used the Bible on both sides. Both the people who supported slavery and the people who opposed it both went to the Bible. But I want to say, looking back now on this whole narrative, we can see that rejecting slavery and rejecting sex slavery is following out themes that are already there in the gospel. And I want to say something similar now about Abraham and Isaac. When the rabbis thought about this story, when Maimonides, for example, thinks about this story, he says, what this teaches us is God doesn't want us to kill our children to show our devotion. And he provided a ram instead. So he replaced child sacrifice with animal sacrifice. And probably Abraham grew up in a culture in which you did show your devotion to God by sacrificing your children. And God then, in that story, replaces that kind of sacrifice. And now we're in that same story, but later on. We're later on because we've also had the Ten Commandments. So we've heard, you shall not kill. We've heard now Jesus. And as we place ourselves in that narrative, we have to read those early stories against the later ones. Loving your enemies. So, yes, there are these hard stories, and I don't want to say I have an easy solution to them, but I think it helps to think of ourselves as in this narrative and taking the narrative as a whole.
I think you've said something to the effect that sometimes God, his commands aren't always what he intends.
Well, yeah, that's the Abraham story. I mean, he tells Abraham to do this. God tells Abraham to take his son, whom he loved, but he didn't want Abraham actually to do it. So this is a story where the command and the intention split. And then so we should ask, which are we supposed to follow, the command or the intention? I think we are not in a position to evaluate God's intentions outside God's commands. So we have to take God's commands as giving us God's intentions, unless God tells us to the contrary.
Comments?
What am I supposed to say to comment on a guy who hears voices that he's got to take his son and sacrifice him? I mean, I hope we can catch him before he starts in on this. I mean, at one level, I want to say it's sicko, sicko, sicko. I mean, yes, at another level, of course, I don't. But of course, you've got to recognize that I'm not going to take I'm not taking any of this literally. I'm going to say, do we see things here, for instance, about obligation, duties to God, these sorts of things? I can understand this. I can also understand that maybe at some level, this is showing that the Jews are moving away from child sacrifice. It's been pointed out to me, since I brought this one up, by my Christian friends, that child sacrifice was very common in the Middle East, and that this is a case where God says, I'm satisfied to have a ram instead of a human, and that perhaps at least part of the story should be read in a very different sort of way, as one which is taking us... Now, you'd have to go over this back and forth, but at least I think it's plausible to do this. So I really am not a very good non-believer at a certain sort of level, because I very much want to take the Bible stories and see what's there. I was talking to Steve at lunchtime. He was shaking his head when I was going up with it because he, I gather that as an engineer, he's very interested in the size of the ark and how you could get all the animals in and all of these sorts of things and that sort of thing. But I was saying, I take the story of Noah as a very profound discussion on simplistic solutions to complex problems. That God says, oh, there's problems here, wipe them all out. And then what happens? After the flood's all over, Noah gets blind drunk and his kid starts laughing at him. In other words, we're right back to square one. And all I can say is I wish Tony Blair and George Bush had read Genesis before they marched into Iraq. Because here, I think, was a simplistic solution to a complex problem that we're still living with. So I'm not one who immediately wants to say the Abraham and Isaac story is, just ridiculous. And at one level it is. It's awful. At another level, at least I'm prepared to say, let's pull back and see if we can make something of this. Because I think there's an awful lot in the Bible of which we can make much. So, I'm a complex non-believer. It doesn't mean to say I'm not a non-believer. Please don't take me as saying I'm on the edge and saying at 73 he'd better be on the bloody edge and he'd better move pretty quickly, otherwise it's going to be a long eternity of shoveling coal. I'm not there. I'm really not. I'm really not. But I've always felt this way. I think being a non-believer is not easy in the way that Richard Dawkins seems to think that it is.
Okay, we're going to move into a time of questions and answers from the audience. So if you want to ask a question of Dr. Ruse, I would say line up behind this microphone here. If you have a question for Dr. Hare, line up along this microphone here. And we would ask that you just make your questions concise and don't be up there giving a lecture to either of them. Make it a question, not a statement. They've probably heard your objections already. So while people are coming forward, this problem of evil really is a problem that cuts both ways. It seems to me that that's maybe one of your biggest reasons for rejecting the Christian God. Is that right?
Yes. I thought it was when I started writing Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? I start to see there are other problems which I think are really difficult for the Christian. The whole authenticity of Adam and Eve and the original sin story and how you get that without a literal Adam and Eve. I mean, we know that Irenaeus of Lyon had an alternative position. So, but I think that's a problem. Having just finished my book on atheism, What Everyone Should Know, I think one of the biggest problems is reconciling the Jewish God, or which I call the Protestant God, with the Platonic God, which I call the Catholic God, or the God of the philosophers. I think there's a lot of coherence problems in Christianity about, is God a person, or is God an eternal, non-changing being? So I think the problem of evil is clearly the one that gets you in the guts. But my own feeling is there are a lot of complex philosophical, theological, which, God forbid, Christians wrestle with. I'm not the first to discover this. Absolutely not. But I do think that there are a lot of serious coherence problems in the whole notion of the Christian God. And, for instance, Aquinas and Anselm say that God does not suffer. They can't suffer. Because he's unchanging at some level, and suffering implies pain at some level, and God can't experience that. And yet, damn it all, I want God standing by Sophie Scholl and weeping. So I do have problems there, yes. Oh my goodness gracious, well.
Okay, we're going to start right over here with Dr. Hare.
Dr. Hare, you said that the position of Dr. Ruse tends to undercut moral convictions. And he seems to have a genuine concern about Sophie and the White Rose. And yet in Germany, a lot of the Lutherans were not like Bonhoeffer or Papa Ten Boom and so forth. Is there something that you think that argues for the Christian faith buttressing moral convictions that could be illustrated from Germany or elsewhere?
Christians under the Third Reich were divided, and pastors were. I think there are people to admire. I admire Karl Barth, I admire Bonhoeffer. There are also people to repudiate. So the historical record there is mixed. But
Thanks very much.
I do think that caring about the suffering of people in that situation and in many others does start and is based in a moral concern. And so what I said to Professor Ruse was, morality here is trumps. It's morality that is causing your unease. And if that's the case, and if morality itself requires a justification, and if the only justification is, as I think he conceded, God, then he's left with God or denying justification. And that's his situation.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. Dr. Ruse, so you mentioned disliking, hate. Can you hear me? Okay. Having hatred for those who are Discovery Institute or those from the evolutionary perspective because they're very absolute about it. I know it. They're convinced of it. And that's correct. You said you don't like that.
I obviously, emotion comes into it.
Okay.
I mean, I often joke about my feeling about God. Having had one headmaster in this life, I don't want another one in the next life. I don't think my headmaster's existence is necessarily a proof of the disproof of God, but I know it affects me emotionally. And there's no question that for me, I don't like enthusiasm. I think that's the phrase that John Locke uses, I think. I grew up as a Quaker, and we were very non-enthusiastic, in the sense that we felt that, not that we didn't care, but that somehow you've got to try to put that kind of emotion to one side. Sure, you've got to have moral indignation at wrongs, of course you have, but that when you're dealing with these big questions, the rah, I'm right, FSU is number one sort of thing. I don't much like it in football, and I like it even less in religion. And I do find that there's something about the new atheists which I personally find psychologically very off-putting. For instance, I just got hold of Atheism for Dummies, and it's that kind of book. It's that kind of rally the troops sort of book. And somehow that's alien to me just as much as whipping you up and, let's go after the atheists or let's go after the sinners or something like that, or against, I think, after the gays or whatever. So, yeah, there's something about, as I say, I use the word enthusiasm, but understand I'm using it in the kind of theological come philosophical sense that I dislike.
Can I just a question from there, I guess, then? So we have a scenario if, I'm walking down the street, I look down the alley, and I see a man raping a woman. Should I come with that gusto, that enthusiasm, say, this is wrong, I run after and stop it? Or do I kind of...
Oh, yeah. But as I say, I don't see that as being enthusiasm in quite that sort of sense. Yeah, I think there's absolutely every place for moral indignation and feeling that certain things are terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. I mean, I had a case even yesterday. I was putting in a colleague for a professorial thing, and it turned out that the colleague had to do it themselves, and that meant that the colleague would see all the letters written on her behalf. And I just went bananas at that point because I felt it was so morally wrong that somebody write a letter in confidence, however positive it may be, that the person in place should be able to see it. You know, and I was very, very, if you like, hot about that. But it wasn't what I mean by enthusiasm. Enthusiasm I see as, you know, what you get at football games. And I don't, dare I say this, coming from FSU, it sounds like I'm, you know, beating up on, but I didn't like it before we won the championship, I don't like it now. And I don't like it in the New Atheists, and I don't like it on the other side either.
Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Oh, hello, Professor Hare. I just have this question that I really want to hear the answer from you. So I became a Christian about a year ago, and there's a lot of questions I've been thinking about. And one thing is the Bible says about the Adam and Eve, and that's how the creation of the human being from God. But how do you explain the evolution in a way that could make sense?
Good. Yes, that's a very difficult question. I myself don't think that Christianity requires me to believe that there was a single Adam and a single Eve created from the dust of the earth. I think that we should accept that human beings come from non-human beings. But I think that God is in charge of that whole process, and that God is using evolution for God's own purposes, and that to say that we have a primate ancestry is not inconsistent with saying that we are in the image of God, that God had a special concern for us. As I said in my talk, God wants to have union with us, and we are the sorts of beings with whom God can have that kind of union. But that means you can't take those chapters of Genesis as a biology textbook.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Russo. I found it interesting that the single argument that you provided for your non-belief, not that I'm saying there aren't others, but looking at the case of Sophie Sharp and how she died and God wouldn't allow such injustice or such a waste of life, to almost presuppose atheism or agnosticism. If you were to presuppose that, you could say, yes, her death was a terrible waste and there is no God. But if we were to assume at first that there is a God and that upon her death she would go to heaven and be in eternal bliss, that her life was not at all a waste, was very justified, and in fact the fact that she serves as inspiration to you and many others would give her death so much meaning that it almost seemed to validate the existence of God. So I'm just curious to hear maybe some of your other reasons for non-belief that caused you to presuppose her life was a waste, or if you just touch on why you came down on that side first.
I'm sorry, I didn't, what exactly?
Could you just concisely ask the question one more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm
a
not
little
being
bit
clever.
hazy as well.
I just didn't get, okay, if I'm not a believer, or I am a believer, okay, which hypothesis am I?
Okay, so what I understand is you assume that God doesn't exist, therefore Sophie's death was an injustice and a waste of life.
Okay.
Why don't we start by assuming God does exist, and therefore her death was justified, inspiring, and had meaning?
Well, I know this sort of move, that God exists and Sophie could only show great love, great moral worth by doing this. But, it brings me back, and as I say, it brings me back to God being all-powerful and all-loving. If, for instance, you take, say, a process philosophy position, which argues that God at some level empties his powers, kenosis, and that therefore God, is co-creator at some level, of course, then I think you can make some sense of Sophie Scholl's death. Of course you can. The only problem is many Christians, I don't know where Professor Hare would stand on this, but certainly many Christians would say process theology is almost worse than being a Richard Dawkins atheist, because you really have, you've just given up on the game. So this is basically my real problem. I go back to the Dostoevsky story that, is this one little child is ripped to shreds, by dogs that the owner of the estate sets on him. And the question is, would you allow the glory for everybody at the cost of this suffering? And the answer was no. Now, I realize that Dostoevsky went on being a Christian, so there's more to the story than that. But my feeling is somehow, I don't know where God was when Sophie Scholl was suffering like this. And of course, the answer is she had to suffer because otherwise we wouldn't have free will, and it was better that Hitler have free will than, God intervene or something. And somehow that just doesn't wash for me. That kind of awful, awful suffering that she went through, that it somehow, I don't think eternal salvation should come at that kind of cost. I really, truly don't think we're not talking about me not being able to do it or you not being able to prevent it. We're talking about a being who's creator, who's all-loving, who's all-powerful. You don't let that sort of thing happen. I mean, dads don't let their kids have the shit beaten out of them or something like that because a greater good will come when the sinner repents. What kind of father would I be if I saw somebody beating my kid up and then I said, well, let it happen because I think we can reclaim this person. We know what, and we can reclaim, not at any kid's expense. The ultimate glory, the ultimate benefits, I just don't see they're worth it.
Thank you.
Take one more question from both sides.
Professor Hare,
Well, hold on one second. Just so that the rest of you don't get discouraged in line, what we're going to do after this, I'm going to allow someone to take the professors downstairs to the speaker's table, and those that are standing in line, let's say you get first crack at asking questions to them down there, okay? So just hold tight for a little bit, but just so that we can be timely here, we're already over about 10 minutes. So we'll do one more question on both sides. Yes.
Walter Sinnott Armstrong, a professing atheist, raises a question in a book he was involved in. It says, if God gave us free will, then he made us separate people. So why wouldn't we have rights not to be killed by him needlessly? So basically, why should we exempt God from the same moral standards that he holds us to in cases of like rape or people dying in horrific ways?
Let me see if I remember the book. Actually, I reviewed it.
Did you read it?
Yes, I did. I did read it. I think this is the problem of evil again, if I've understood you right. God allows these horrendous things. God doesn't seem to be under the same moral standards as we are. So let me just say something about the problem of evil, because I haven't said anything about that yet. I think you should ask Sophie. Now, I say that seriously because when we read the stories of the people who went through this kind of suffering with faith, when we read Elie Wiesel, for example, what he says is not that God gave him an answer about why this was allowed, but that he got closer to God through his anger with God. I think we have to listen to the people who actually went through this and not try to project onto them our own feelings. Now, in the Brothers Karamazov, that story is told by Ivan, told to Alyosha. As the story goes on, there's a narrative. Ivan gets torn apart. He can't sustain it. He imagines Satan coming in, and he's torn apart. Alyosha ends the story surrounded by a group of children in delight and joy. And I think we're supposed to hear something. We're supposed to hear what that sort of story told in that sort of way means for a life. And what Dostoevsky is telling us is morality, if we're going to sustain it, if it's going to be stable, requires God.
Well, what about Anne Frank, John, who did not go to her death willingly, let us say, like Sophie Scholl did? Let's say that at some level, Sophie consciously chose this route, or as you would say, this route, but who consciously chose it. And at some level, one can see good coming through and out of this. But Anne Frank lived 2 years in terror. She was betrayed. She died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen in, April? You know, how does one explain that, John? I mean,
I don't know. I don't think we should claim to know, but I think we should take very seriously the experiences of the people who had faith in God and went through this. And I think the way you told the story actually didn't take that seriously enough.
Of course, I know that, some of your co-religionists, like Alvin Plantinga, would want to say, well, God is absolute, God is sovereign, and what God decides is almost good by definition. And if God decided that this was the way it should be, then we have to accept it as good. And I don't like that one.
Yeah, I think that we should, as people of faith, think that we are in the hands of a loving God. But we shouldn't think that that means we know what God is doing.
When I was a child, I thought as a child. And now you think that later we're going to see clarity?
I think we'll see more. I don't think we'll ever be God. Some of the process, I think theologians thought that we were actually going to become God. But I don't think we're going to become God, so we won't ever enter into God's mind. But I think we will see more than we do now.
John, make me a promise, when it's all over, will you sort of go down the shooting thing and yell down at me and tell me some of the truths as I shovel the coal?
Well, this is like the story of Lazarus.
Yes, go ahead.
Last one.
I come forward not to intimidate you because I can hear it better when you're doing that. Okay.
That's all right. This question is kind of similar to the other ones, but I was just wondering, you talk a lot about how the death of Anne Frank and the death of Sophie are, like, why would God allow these horrible deaths to happen or whatever? I was just wondering where your stance on free will comes into play, because even back when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they had the choice to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil or to not eat from the tree, God could have just as easily stepped in and removed that tree and said, okay, well, I'm going to intervene here so that you don't make this horrible mistake, so that all this sin doesn't come into the world. Why is, I guess, like, the fact of free will is kind of, to me, why God allows these horrible deaths to happen, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, of course, I do believe in free will. I mean, I guess I'm a compatibilist, but I certainly am not in the business of denying free will. In fact, this is what makes the whole thing so painfully tragic, and I fully accept that Sophie chose this. I mean, that from everything we know about this was the incredible bravery of this girl. She was not like Blanche in the dialogues of the Poulenc's dialogue of the Carmelites, where, it was reluctant or anything like this. She from what one can make out, she clearly knew what was going to happen and bravely embraced this. But as I say, it happened because Hitler had free will, and Goebbels had free will, and Himmler had free will, and all of the other, horrible people had free will. And somehow, I don't see giving them free will is a great enough good to justify, if not Sophie's death, then Anne Frank's death and others, all those Jews, including the children, packed into those ovens and the Cyclone B thrown in. To me, Tuesday night, the State of the Union address, and to see that injured soldier, I don't know, I expect most of you saw it, I could hardly sleep after that. That something like this would happen to a young person, and that this is their life and the family and everything like that. I accept that it happens. I accept that he was a soldier and freely chose this. I mean, so at one level, yeah, but I can't get my head around an all-loving father who's powerful too. As I say, if you want to take some of this away and make God a more impersonal being, or more like the process theology or something like that, then I can see how you can work this out. But of course, that's not the Christian God. I don't care what anybody says. Process theology is not Christianity. And that's my problem. You set God up to be so good and so powerful and so everything, and then these things happen. And that's where I just can't get my head around these things.
Thank you.
Okay, before we make some final comments here, I'm going to have you guys thank the speakers for coming in. They did a phenomenal job. They're going to go downstairs now. We're going to have, we've got some tables down there. I explained what those were last night. There's a speaker table in particular. I'll mention what those are again and what's going to happen tonight. But this has been very difficult, I know, for them. Difficult for me here. I would like to ask a ton more questions for the next 3 hours. At every point they make, they both know that there are objections that can come on both sides. So it's difficult in front of the audience where they're specialists.
I know
just
he's
try
got
to
more
keep it.
problems than I have.
He's got more problems?
This gives me a certain strength. That,
Okay. All right, I'll let them go down and argue in the hallway on the way. Ben is over here.
Listen,
Thank you,
before we
professors.
finish, let me say, as at some level, the outsider, I appreciate this. I appreciate you, John. I appreciate you too, Corey. I think that I think this is the kind of interaction that we should have, because these are really important issues. Thanks for coming out.
I wanted to. Those were good words. I mean, we can disagree with each other quite significantly without animosity, and we can carry on a conversation across those divides. So, thank you.